flew Porter Airlines to the Sioux, where I've never been, and drove down, and it was just incredible. I mean, just incredible. Look, I want to talk a little bit about the report we released this morning, and then, but not just talk about that report, talk about the important work Rip and the Kresge team and all of you have been doing on placemaking and city building in Detroit, in the Detroit region, and in Michigan, and also not just Michigan, across the country and across the world. So we released this morning a report called Michigan's Great Inflection, a strategy for technology and talent. That was supported by the Chamber, by the Mich Auto program, by the state of Michigan. And Glenn Stevens and his team, Sandy and their team, and we had a very, very, very lovely conversation with the governor, and I noticed the lieutenant governor, he was just here previously, a lovely conversation with the governor and the lieutenant governor about this. And to me, this is sort of amazing. A long time ago, before many of you were even born, I was invited as a wee assistant professor with support of another foundation at the time, the Joyce Foundation from Chicago. A wee toddler academic. I had done a study with my students at Carnegie Mellon on rebuilding America's manufacturing heartland. It was the first time I was here. Lord God, John Engler was governor. I don't even know how long ago that was, but it was a long, and it was convened, it was not this conference, it was here. It was convened by the Council of Great Lakes Governors. And at that time, before I even knew where the Canadian border was, the Council of Great Lakes Governors were the 8 states that bordered the Great Lakes, plus the 2 Canadian provinces, Ontario and Quebec. So it was a wonderful meeting, but I feel like it's come full circle. After all the other work I've done on the creative class and on cities, what this report that we released this morning is about is really how Michigan can be a pivot, isn't a pivot, but can be a pivot for bringing technology to an incumbent industry, the auto industry. So he called it Michigan's Great Inflection. Last night at a little dinner, the governor even mentioned it, which was so lovely. And the idea being that there's a pivot from the internal combustion engine to these new technologies of electrification, of sustainability, of the car being a digital vehicle powered by software, upgradable app, and how Michigan can compete and win. Now, in that report, we dispel some myths. We dispel the myths that Michigan doesn't retain talent. In fact, Michigan retains a tremendous amount of talent, ranked 7th nationally in talent retention. Detroit, according to research done by a fellow named Jonathan Rothwell, then at Brookings, now at Gallup, who looked at the LinkedIn data, Detroit actually has the highest rate of retention of graduates of 2- and 4-year institutions of any metropolitan area in the country. We talk about the assets in terms of research and development. 49%, nearly half of all research and development done by business in the automotive sector, in the transportation sector is done in Michigan. If you take the motor vehicle sector, it's 67%, 625,000 students at these great universities, a cauldron of research. And in that piece, we call for an alignment, working together, as we are in Mackinac, to align university, technology, startups, civic sector, academic sector. But here's what's so interesting. You can read the report. Oh, it's deadly boring and long. You can read it. It's online this morning. We have a little op-ed in the news. But here's the thing. In doing that report, I began to talk to people around the state of Michigan. And one day, in doing our little interviews and focus groups, I have a conversation, and I told Anika this. Lord God, I learned so much reading your. She doesn't believe me. We downloaded every report, Detroit Future City, and I read all of them. And this is the God's truth. And I cite this, and I say this. Look, we are trying to build on the work. And I talked to a colleague, Lou Glazer, in a conversation. Lou said to me, you know, Richard, there has been this emphasis on place in our community, and placemaking. And you should look into this in a little more detail. Not just focus on, you know, and you're an urbanist, and we know you know about technology. You should look at place and placemaking. So I talk in that report about creating an aligning vehicle. Look, I said to the governor last night, I said, Governor, you have so many commissions and committees and alliances and consortia. I don't want to add another one. All I'm suggesting in the report is that you need to convene a little group to focus on this, how to use these new technologies to propel an incumbent industry. And I talked to her, and she liked this idea. In the past, and Rip, this is something Bob Putnam and I had talked about at Harvard. I was actually in a big group at Harvard on technological transformation and older industrial communities. We talked about this, and there were two approaches to this in the past. One is called shifting, where you invent a new technology, typically in a new region like a Silicon Valley, and you just, whether it's semiconductors or computers or biotechnology, and then you let everything else go. The heck with steel, the heck with textiles. You let them go. Boston, we abandon textiles, we go to computers. Pittsburgh, we abandon steel, we go to robots. And then there's deepening, which is kind of the German strategy. Make that steel industry as efficient as you can. Make that I said, Michigan can do both. It can shift and deepen at the same time. It can use these new technologies of battery, electrification, to reinvent the auto industry. Well, anyway, I give 3 pillars for this new group that I say you should think about creating. Focus on technology, transformational technology, work on the startups. Focus on talent. You don't have to worry about retaining talent. You have to attract talent. You need to get keep those great computer scientists and software engineers and attract them. But then, because of these conversations and reading Anika's work, Detroit Future City, talking to Lou, we have a third one, place and placemaking as a technological and economic advantage. And that's what I want to talk about. Why? Well, if you think back to the founding of this place, a century or so ago, during the great industrial age, what was the central organizing platform of the industrial age? It was the corporation, the big, giant, mega corporation. That's the era of General Motors and Ford. When IBM stands for not International Business Machines, I've been moved. You went where the corporation sent you. My dad took a job at age 13 in Newark, New Jersey to help support the family. It took 9 people to make a family wage. My dad went off and served in World War II, went back to work for the same company. He worked for the same company from age 13 to age 65. But now in the knowledge economy, where in the auto industry, there is a much higher percentage of people who work in, Peter Drucker said this in 1948 in his classic study of General Motors. The auto industry is transferring to a knowledge, this is where the idea of a knowledge industry comes from. Peter Drucker's work on General Motors. Now there are double or triple the number of knowledge workers in the auto industry compared to production workers. A quarter of workers in Michigan's auto industry are computer scientists or engineers. In the knowledge economy, the container, the platform, the social organizing unit of the economy is no longer the corporation, it's place. Place is where people come, it's where talent gravitates to, it's how people are matched to jobs. You hear this now in the era of remote work. You know, I used to be in the weeds on this. No one listened, they thought it was a Pied Piper. Now you pick up the newspaper. I wrote a book, Who's Your City? Why the place you choose to live is the most important decision you'll ever make. People said I was insane. The most important decision is where you get a job. I said, no. The most important decision is where you live, because where you get a job, where you send your kids to school, who you meet, your networks depend on place. Now this is everywhere. The Wall Street Journal, Detroit Free Press, Detroit News, New York Times. Oh, place is important. These remote workers are picking where they want to live. Tulsa is, I see Warren out here. Traverse City has been noted as a place that not only is competing for these remote workers, Traverse City has been noted by the Brookings Institution as the community that understands place-based, talent-based economic development. So place has entered the conversation. Now, this is a lovely alignment, because Rip at the folks at Kresge have been working on this small little minor problem of place and placemaking in city building for as long as I've been writing about it. So what we concluded in this study is not only place is important to economic development, but you have a real advantage here in Michigan. Because you have this incredible portfolio of places that give people choice in where they want to live. And this is super important. It's not like people all want to live in the same kind of place. And I think this is unique. We're going to talk about this. I think this is also unique to America. A little bit different in Europe, also a little bit different in Canada, where Ron and I spend a good part of our time. That in America, the portfolio of places and the choices of place are also age and demography dependent. I hope everyone age and demography dependent. And also social class, socioeconomically dependent. So one of the things that's very important is that people who are mobile and are able to be mobile and are able to move across places, who have geographic mobility, also tend to do much better in terms of their socioeconomic mobility. There are also people who are highly rooted, people who have social ties, community ties, who don't want to leave their place, who are committed to their place. And then there are people who are just stuck, who don't have the resources or capability to move. Demographically speaking, in the United States, I think we have three cohorts. The first cohort are young people. And the first big group who can choose places are people once they graduate university or get an advanced degree, who get to choose. In fact, the assignment in my MBA class at the University of Toronto, the first assignment in my class, they have to develop a strategy, not for where they're going to go to work. Their assignment is develop a strategy for where you will move post your MBA degree. And they have to evaluate and do a process of evaluating, comparing cities. And then in the United States, I think people tend to move oftentimes to big cities, superstar cities, coastal cities, until it's family formation time. And just to help a little bit understand the pandemic, something I've done a tremendous amount of work on, I think what people misinterpreted as the abandonment of cities during the pandemic was a compressed, accelerated set of family formation moves. What happened, to be honest, having written about the creative class in the year 2000, there were a bunch of young people who decided that cities were interesting places to live around the year 2000, and that group grew after the year 2010, and all of a sudden, that whole cohort of people turned 25, 35, 40, either had families or were planning to have families or adding children, and that just compressed family formation moves. But instead of just moving to the suburbs of New York or Boston or Chicago or Los Angeles or San Francisco, now they had a much bigger portfolio of places because of remote work. They could choose to move to places like Nashville or Miami or Austin or Traverse City. And then the third set of moves comes when the kids are left and you're an empty nester. Well, what we discovered is that Michigan actually has an amazing portfolio of places to offer people. And I have a little bit of a hypothesis and an intuition, and oftentimes, not always, but oftentimes my intuition is right, that what is happening now, it used to be that, and I wrote a book on this called The New Urban Crisis in 2017, that the New Urban Crisis argument was, the old urban crisis, and I'm from Newark, was a crisis of economic despair and dysfunction. And that cities were declining because economic activity, industrial activity, were deindustrializing, middle-class families were moving out. I think I told you this. In Newark, what was the leading department store in Newark when I was a boy? Might you remember? I think it was called Kresge's, actually. And it's the first department store I ever went to. But then all of a sudden, Kresge's closed, and Bamberger's closed, and my dad's factory closed. And people moved out of Newark, which was a thriving, bustling, Philip Roth kind of city when I was a boy. Anyway, now the new urban crisis, I argued, was a crisis of success. Cities had become so expensive, New York and Chicago and LA and San Francisco, that people couldn't afford to live there. But now what's happened is all the second-tier cities that Steve Case calls the rise of the rest, Nashville and Miami and Austin, and have become expensive. The Heartland region, the Great Lakes region, Michigan offers a quality of life at a price point that's affordable, and you can already see it. You can already see the eyeballs turning, not just to Michigan, but to other states in this part of the world that are more affordable. So Michigan has something turning towards it, an affordability, quality of life, through all the things, but it has a portfolio of places. Look at what's happened in Detroit. I mean, you all know this better than me. But I've been coming to Detroit for a long, long time. If you had asked me 20 or 30 years ago, could this happen? I would have said, it's inconceivable. But it has happened. And it is happening. And more is happening with things like Michigan Central. You look around and you look at the suburban communities in Michigan, what they offer at a price point and a quality of life, schools, education, the ability to get your kids into good universities and colleges. You know, we were talking earlier with the president of Michigan Tech. He said, you not only have a portfolio of places, you have a portfolio of colleges and universities. Think about this as a place advantage and a higher education advantage, market the darn state for the universities and colleges. You have spectacular rural communities, farming communities. You have these magnificent Great Lakes. All the stuff that's happening in Traverse City here in the UP, attracting people. But one of the things we triggered in the report, I want to talk about two things and then we'll have our conversation. One of the things we discovered in the report, and Lou Glazer really triggered this, is when he said, look at Ann Arbor versus Austin. Look at how Austin has been that tech hub in Texas. Look at Ann Arbor, and we did. And one of the things we found is that Austin has grown 500 times over the past 20 or 30 years. Ann Arbor has grown 58%. You look, there was a recent article in The Bridge on Columbus, Ohio, a place I lived. I taught at Ohio State, and how that's become an anchor of their economic development. One of the things the report suggests in building up this portfolio of places, it's time to take the learnings at Kresge and Detroit and Grand Rapids and all of them. I mean, we could go chapter and verse on all these great communities and maybe apply some of those learnings to the college towns. And the reason is I spent 20 years of my career in Pittsburgh. And actually, the idea for Rise of the Creative Class came out of trying to understand why our young computer scientists and software engineers, not a single one would stay in Pittsburgh. And when I asked them where they preferred to live, they said Austin, Texas. So this triggered something in me. Our college engineering students, software engineers, artificial intelligence, computer science people, they didn't want to go to San Francisco or New York or Boston or the big city. They wanted to go to an accessible college town that felt manageable to them. And that book really, if you read it, is a comparison of Pittsburgh. Everything else that's going on there is a comparison of my hometown that I love, Pittsburgh and Austin. Why is it happening in Austin, not in Pittsburgh? Well, the idea being that maybe it's time to consider a place-making agenda around not just Ann Arbor is the one we use. It could be East Lansing. It should be East Lansing. It should be Detroit, because Detroit is a big college town. Thinking more about these decisions of college students, particularly in computer science and engineering, the fields critical to your industrial transformation, and what it would take to glue them. How do you grow and scale them? And the little chime on the wall says, two more things. And I see I have 2 minutes. Two more things. And we talked about this. We're going to talk more about it. Rana and I live in Toronto. We live in a family-friendly city. Our kids are 6 and 7, can walk to 5 schools. And I would say within, and I did this research the other night on Google Maps, it's a 5 to 10 minute drive to 15 others. There are kids everywhere, and not just affluent people kids. When we came to Toronto, we had a housekeeper. Her name was Ella. Ella had a daughter, Filipina housekeeper. Ella's daughter is now a senior at the University of Toronto, a school that ties with the University of Michigan in global rankings. Not just our kids, as I say that, of affluent, knowledge-based, college-educated families. All kids can get on that mobility agenda. All kids, because schools are provincially funded. Not every school is equal. Yeah, parents pad one or another in their neighborhood a little bit more, but those schools are much more equal. I think one of the agendas we have to talk about in the United States and where you can lead, and I know Kresge has been, Anika, everyone's been working on this. How do we make our cities, starting with Detroit, family-friendly? And the thing I'll end with, and hopefully you don't think I've lost my marbles, you're looking at a tsunami coming at you. Rana knows this. My intuition is usually right. When I sense a place is changing, there's a good reason for that. Accumulated knowledge, wisdom, 4 decades of doing this. When I said this in Nashville, people laughed at me. Nashville will never become it. Go try to buy a house in Nashville. Go look at Realtor.com and try to buy a house in Nashville. When I went to Bentonville, Arkansas for the Walton Family Foundation, and I said, what you're doing here in Bentonville is going to take off. And Bentonville's going to become unaffordable. They were literally rolling on the ground. You know what I just did? An affordable housing strategy for Bentonville, Arkansas. Once this flywheel gets turning, and with all the capacity you have, the advantage you have now in offering great quality of life because of placemaking and affordability will start to erode. So I want you to keep your eye on the ball of affordability, diversity, and inclusion. Anyway, thanks for listening to me, and we're going to have a great conversation.
Joining Richard Florida on stage, please welcome Chief Executive Officer of Detroit Future City, Anika Goss. And to moderate the discussion, President and Chief Executive Officer of the Kresge Foundation, Rip Rapson.
Well, I think my challenge is to take down the energy a little bit, so I'll start.
Too much coffee, Rip.
This is, I was trying to think before Richard took the stage of how over the top he was going to be. And I realized that over the top for Richard is actually factually predicated, research-based, and historically grounded. So we'll take you seriously. We will assume that the flywheel of Michigan cities is spinning quickly and is going to vault us into the next generation of work. But having said that, it's so upbeat. What are the sands that are going to grind that flywheel to a halt?
Well, I mean, look, I'll go with the American challenges first, and then the Michigan-Detroit specific challenges. I mean, the American challenges are challenges of race and class. And if I was going to write, I have a couple books I want to write. I don't think I'll ever write them, because now I know how hard they are to write. But this new oligarchy that's developed in this country is really horrific. And you're talking about a concentration of wealth we have never seen. I mean, you could say the 20s, but I don't think we've ever seen anything like this. And it's very irritating. It's not just, and I think what's really irritating, because I study political movements, not just irritating with regard to Bill Wilson's underclass and the disadvantage, but the youngsters coming out of the knowledge-based communities feel it already. They know that they're not going to have a great run. So you could see a tension building in the society. You can feel the backlash. I think the guns are insane. As someone, and this is what keeps us in Canada, we love it here, but we feel much safer there. I think these are the American problems. And then I think the Michigan problems are staying focused on inclusion, as you both, Lord, I learned so much from both of you. You know, we're not going to make this, and look, I didn't write I don't want to defend myself, but the creative class is sometimes interpreted as this homage to the wealthy, artistic, musical. And I said, in that book, the last line, the creative class needs to grow up and figure out who they are and how to build an inclusive society. That's the last line in that book. So I think this inclusion agenda is very important. And then finally, I think, look, everything is pointing in your favor, and that's what our little report, right? I say, you know more about this than me. I'm just a little bit of an outsider and come add and maybe elevate it slightly, the alignment issue. I think is so important. Aligning what you're doing, what the economic developers are doing. And maybe the one thing I'd say, and please don't hate me for this, is that the universities and, Michigan Tech, and I think the community colleges are on this, and I think it's getting there. I think the universities need to understand a little bit more their role in placement. Not a lot. They're already getting there, but a little bit more alignment between what the universities are doing, and they're getting there, and the community. So that's what I think. That's the grinding.
And I'll turn to Anika in just a moment, but what does that look like? What does an alignment with a university based in Ann Arbor, just hypothetically, what does that have to do with how the city of Detroit evolves?
Well, first of all, you have a great new president who is Canadian and was president of UBC, and also led this in Cincinnati. So knows this area. I think the same is true of Michigan State. I think Wayne State's, I think all of them, they all need, and look, this is a college, somebody said today this is a college, it should be a college state higher education destination. I think, I can give you two examples. When I lived in Pittsburgh, we really advocated for Carnegie Mellon becoming involved in this and for the city, and really the leadership of the city thought I was completely batshit crazy. I mean, there's this young kid at Carnegie Mellon arguing the future is the universities, and now they say, when I meet with them, you were right, Richard. You were right about this. I think the other one that's a very good exemplar now is Nashville. In the ivy-colored walls of Vanderbilt University, where I was never allowed to enter, there's a new chancellor there, Dan Diermeyer, who's spectacular, and working hand in glove with the city. He's actually going to try to build a new neighborhood adjacent to Vanderbilt, which is an inclusive neighborhood, which is a walkable, pedestrian-friendly, Kresge, placemaking kind of neighborhood. So yeah, I think that here's the other thing. if you think about it, you really think about it. Now, you have some great anchors in Detroit that most communities don't. You have GM, you have the big corporates, you have you guys, the foundations. Most cities don't have that anymore. The universities are the last remaining anchors. You know this terminology. So I think increasingly the university heads are being called upon to do more. So I think that's the alignment, though, really working hand in glove. I think for Detroit and Ann Arbor, and also I put East Lansing, a nice corridor where they're really seeing themselves not in competition with one another, but part of something that works together. And, you know, when this works, you know, there's Palo Alto, which is the high-tech hub, was the high-tech hub in Silicon Valley. That fueled the development of San Francisco and San Jose. Austin didn't compete with Dallas, it kind of fueled it. North Carolina Research Triangle, but the other one, Boulder, Denver. I think when it works together.
So, Anika, you've written as an institution so extensively about both the upside possibilities of an inclusive economic growth strategy for the region, but also the impediments, how we continued to stumble. Say a word about both, would you?
Yeah, so first of all, I'd like to thank you, Richard, for including us, and thank you, Rip, for including us this morning. One of the things that I was both excited about, but to your point, was concerned about was this, this notion that by focusing on race and equity, we can create a specific program that can solve it. And I think what we found, and at least in our research, is that at all levels, at all education levels, and at all growth occupation levels, so by growth occupations, meaning the highest growing occupations that are related to our region, we're still finding these kind of discriminatory practices where Black and brown workers are excluded for reasons they're not quite sure, and where they are competitive with other white workers that have the same education level, the same experience. And so I think really the point to really get to what Richard is talking about, if we're going to actually organize ourselves really effectively around the future of economic development and the future of work that includes young people and is knowledge-based and talent-driven, we have to actually really focus on how we create an inclusive economic strategy where you can enter that, you can on-ramp to that economic strategy and prosper regardless of where you live, your ethnicity, your education level. And I feel like there is a value proposition here, right? Like this isn't just because we're in the Midwest and we're nice and that's what we should be doing. There is an economic value proposition for Michigan to make sure that everyone can prosper in the new economic development strategy.
I just want to say that you have to realize how important what you do. There are many regions of the country, one we spend the winter in Miami, which has no fact base like Detroit Future City. It is so important what you've built and how you provide facts and enable this discussion to occur. Because, you know, the mayor of Miami, when asked this question, Francois Suarez, you know what he said? Tell them to get a job in a tech company. This was his answer.
Yeah.
And when you look at that Business Leaders of Michigan study, that they've learned, it's amazing to me. You show the facts, Lou does his, which is a little different. The facts come together, and then the business leader community says, oh, we need a holistic, inclusive. Right. So what you've done here to create facts and data, and that helps the whole thing.
A quick check. I want to make sure that people know that we're going to be taking questions in just a moment. I hope that there are cards at your table. Fill them out, pass them up front, and we'll get to them. And before I forget, we will have copies of Richard's report as you go out. So just a quick check. The challenge of pulling together the public and the private and the civic sectors in some kind of alignment around these objectives is elusive. I mean, we have an enormously enlightened administration here in Michigan and superb mayors, but it is really hard to create a machinery that does what you've just described. What are the two things you would tell Governor Whitmer to do, Richard?
Well, I mean, I said, look, she can't do this herself. She needs help and she needs political cover. So she needs a group. She needs a broad-based group. I called it a META, Michigan Economic Transformation Alliance. She needs a group that's going to help her. And the other thing I said is she's I want to say this gently and lovingly because I love this state. But right now you are subsidizing your competition. You're using Michigan taxpayer dollars to subsidize the coastal high-tech economies. Now, look, if I'm a youngster coming out of University of Michigan, Wayne State, Michigan Tech, MSU, I want to go in a good job in a good place. So yeah, it might drift me towards San Francisco or New York or wherever, just like all of our nieces and nephews, right? Who grew born and bred here are going to go away, except they're back for Technofest, sorry. I think you need to think about that and what would it take to keep them. And what I said is that's the issue they confronted at Stanford 50 years ago, in Boston, at MIT and Harvard, and they figured that out. So you've got to work really hard. And you know, when I get the calls from kids who graduated our MBA program or others, and they said, well, I went to work for XYZ financial institution, hedge fund, consulting company, and I'm miserable. Maybe it's also telling them they can be part of something bigger than, now look, you have to have the wages that are comparable, but they can be part of something bigger than them. So that's the other thing. I think really working with the higher education leaders to get, I think everybody else is close, they're getting there. I think that's the other thing I would tell her.
Anika, this is probably not fair, but you know, if you combine an enlightened administration at the state level, a federal administration that is eager to pour money into state and localities for presumably transformative work, what's the problem? Where are we stalling?
Wow. Okay. I really think, I don't know if I have a direct answer to that in the short period of time that we're here. I really do believe that part of why we can't move forward in southeastern Michigan is, one, we're still too divided as a region, right? Like,
It's a matter of governance?
as a matter of not only governments, but how we even view the talent that is coming from this region. And we don't see Detroit as having the kind of talent pool that can drive this creative class, this knowledge-based economy. And we believe that the surrounding region is the only place where we can get that from. And that's very difficult to counter. Furthermore, we do have this perception that Detroit is only a poor Black city, uneducated city. And that is a perception that we constantly are fighting against. And until we can break that perception, and this was something that we talked about even yesterday in the report, where it's recommended that, you know, when you're young, you'll live downtown because downtown is great. And then when you have kids, then you'll move to Troy and Birmingham. So smart. Mm-hmm. And we have a lot of great neighborhoods in Detroit, and people are raising great kids in Detroit, talented kids that are going on to college and that are coming back and we want them to come back and work in Detroit, and we want Detroit to be a city of knowledge and creativity, and there are a lot of people that are working together towards that. And so I do feel like in cities that have been successful in this, right, even cities that are considered are the more industrial cities or weaker market cities, Cleveland, Columbus, Baltimore, Pittsburgh, number one, right? They have really worked together to change the perception because it benefits everyone to change that perception. And if we can move away from that, of trying to lead with, we're a poor Black city, come help us. If we are leading with, we have a lot of talent here, and we are a part of this. We are driving Michigan's economy, just like every other. We are the largest city, and we are the largest region. So we should be driving and making investments to drive that region, to drive Michigan forward.
So three things. Thank you. Nicely said. So three things really quickly just to build on that. One, there is no doubt in my mind that Detroit remains a fountain of incredible creativity. That's why I wrote Rise of the Creative Class. If you look at creativity and why I included people not only in high-tech innovation and management, but music and the arts, and not only those, you could argue that Detroit is arguably the most creative city in the history of America. I could make that argument very, very, very easily. Secondly, that building a family-friendly city, which is something we all have to be committed to. I think the reason people make that shift, perception or not perception, and we talked a little bit about, hopefully we're going to get to this, there's also economic incentives that push you to the suburbs. So please, I don't believe that, but I think that is a move that people make. I only hope we can build. But I'm going to say something that Rip and I talked about when you said something big. Rip, when we had a conversation, mentioned Marygrove College and the residency program, and I have an idea, I've had this idea, that what the world needs is not more technology first, industrial first, centers of excellence and research centers. It needs to put cities in place at the forefront of technological innovation. I believe this for a long time, that this whole area of technological innovation, the city is the platform. Well, our National Science Foundation doesn't really invest in that. Our big governmental agencies don't invest in that. There's an opportunity to create a center for cities, or what I call a school for cities, a teaching hospital for cities. I really believe this, and Rip knows, I've talked to him. I've been unable to do it, but I think this idea of it, when you said this residency, this teaching hospital for cities, where you bring together mayors and urban leaders and youngsters and people who want to study it and university, and you build research out of that, and all of this mobility stuff and housing and affordability, modularity. I don't know all this stuff. I'm not a technologist, but Lord God, what other place would you put this darn thing in? Right. Am I nuts? I mean, I'm just pitching you, you don't have to do it. But if this thing was in Detroit, and you could, and then the federal government and the Biden and the tech hubs and all of this, you could make such an incredible thing. So anyway, I hope there's something there. You're looking at me like I'm crazy. On to questions.
I love that.
No. Well, given that, and given the questions, we're going to extend the session till 1:30, if that's all right with folks.
2:30.
2:30. A number of the questions relate to some of the more difficult structural issues that the region faces. And the first card that was handed to me was this. The Detroit News is reporting that Mayor Duggan will roll out a proposed split land value tax option later this afternoon. How do you think a split land value tax will impact Detroit and other cities in Michigan? It sounds like a wonky question, but the fundamental restructuring of our property tax, land tax, to make sure that wealth creation is possible in a very different way in the community is indeed a structural issue. And I don't know, Richard, you've written about this, haven't you?
Why don't you? We actually talked a little bit about this.
Oh, you talked? Oh, fine. Go ahead.
Yeah, that by creating parity, it actually allows for Detroit to become an economic value proposition for residents, right? There's some neighborhoods where the taxes are as much as 40% higher than the suburbs. And if you're a Detroit resident, you know that your taxes are unreasonably high. And so this really creates that parity so that we can begin to really market Detroit neighborhoods and provide relief for the residents that are here so they don't feel like they have to leave just because it's not economically feasible.
And in Toronto, our taxes are at parity or better. If an urban dweller, Ron and I always say this, our provincial taxes are a little higher, but in terms of our property taxes, there is no advantage the way here. The other thing I wanted to add to that, I think it's about, and I think that's one of the incentives, if you will, that pushes people out of the city, the urban center, to the suburbs. The only other thing I was going to say is that the fellow who invented this idea, just to give you background, is a fellow named Henry George. He was absolutely brilliant. And this is very important. His counterpart was Karl Marx. Karl Marx defined the world in terms of two classes, the working class and the capitalist class, and argued that the capitalist class drew its wealth from taking it from the working class. Henry George said, I like this Marx guy, but he's got it wrong. There are three classes. There is the proletariat, the working class, the capitalist class, and the landlord class. And the people making off with the money are the landlord. And that's why he proposed the land value tax as a way to take, and if you think about America today, all of this innovation and productivity that we are creating in this country, where's it going? The price of real estate. It's just going into the housing market. The more we get productive, you could almost get productivity and innovative measure, housing price measure. So this land value tax is quite ingenious. It creates parity between suburb and city, but also is a way to recycle, if you will, and create development and recycle those dollars and that productivity into the built environment. It's a lovely idea. And none other than Milton Friedman, not a person I have a lot of agreement with, called it the one best tax.
Well, for folks who may not yet be familiar with what Mayor Duggan's going to propose, in simple terms, what's it do?
And now you're asking. I am not the
I can do it.
tax policy. Okay, good.
But I'm not an expert. No, you're more an expert in Detroit. I'm more an expert in this.
I know what it does.
The idea is that in a property tax, you tax the level of development. So if you have a fancy house, that is taxed more than a less fancy house. The idea of a land value tax is you tax the level of undevelopment.
Right.
So if you have a parking lot that's empty, and you have every advantage to keep it empty or a vacant lot, people park cars and you collect, and then you tax that so that you spur development. That's the basic fundamental idea.
Okay, well, we'll let Mayor Duggan explain the rest.
Yes.
He's here.
One of the other structural pieces that this conference has talked about frequently over the years is transportation. The question here is, how can Detroit attract young talent without better public transportation? It feels like that should be the priority. Is that, well, maybe, could I get Richard?
Yeah.
As you look at other cities, how true is that?
God. The pandemic has forced me to question so many assumptions that I've had. Like, I was always and I'm not a big fan of subsidizing sports stadia, but things that get people back downtown, I'm less nervous about than I was, and because not back to the office. I believe that public transit is necessary, but we've always thought of public transit as a way just to move workers. There is a new study out in New York, I believe there's one in San Francisco, really looking at this, and from groups like your group. And they say there's two things. One, we need to make sure less advantaged people can still get to work. But two, we have to rethink public transit as more lifestyle and less work commuting, or at least blended. So yeah, I think we really need to think long and hard about the nature of public, and if we don't have a big system that we have to realign, that's an advantage in thinking about that system, but it's no longer just a get-to-work system. Public transit, even being used in San Francisco, New York, and other places, is more a lifestyle, entertainment, going out, and things like that.
Well, I do think we're at a very different place. We sat in this room 4 or 5 years ago, and the idea of some kind of regional transit system was really an unattainable aspiration. But I think now our county executives are really taking deep leadership strides to make this possible. It may not be exactly the plan that all of us were looking for 10 years ago, but it's slowly sort of taking
shape. In an era of remote work, I would also encourage you to think about the connections between Detroit, other Michigan cities, and other important cities. And I'll make this up, Chicago and Toronto. I mean, I'm just winging it here, but I think it's a regional system, and then what would be the other natural economic units that you would connect to? And this idea of mega region is very important. It's becoming more important with the pandemic, that the super commuting sheds are getting more elongated. And that's very nice for a region like this, to at least begin a process of thinking about that.
One would think it would make sense to connect Ann Arbor and Detroit, no?
For sure. And I think that whole idea of those corridors are very important.
Okay. This question asks, how can regional placemaking help address our population loss?
Yeah, I mean, I think thinking about, well, first of all, I love the concept that Michigan Futures is really pushing, this idea of the neighborhood transformation areas that specifically focus on regions and neighborhoods within a region as attraction places for a diverse set of young people. And I feel like that's really what's going to be required. You have to be able to focus on both attraction and retention, and really being for all of the regions, right? And it's not a city component, because economic development is not city focused, it's regional focused. So being able to really focus on place-based, focused on specific demographic populations that you want to retain and attract, I think is really what will actually move these places. So parks, open space, transportation that we talked about, diverse housing, all of these things is what goes into high quality placemaking.
It's a great initiative. The idea of, I forget if it was 5 or 10 or 20, but you create a bucket of funding, you have a competition, statewide competition, to make greater places with the investment, as just you said, open space, mixed-use corridors, remote working situations, transit-based development. Quite brilliant. I think with regard to population loss, the answer is pretty simple. Every large city in America, including most Sunbelt cities, including Miami, loses domestic population. The only thing that complements for that is immigration. The only thing that makes a New York City or a Los Angeles or Miami grow, Sunbelt boom down, no. Miami lost 80,000, I forget, but it's in the ballpark of 80,000 people in the Miami-Dade County region, domestic migrants. They moved to cheaper parts of Florida, basically. The thing that fueled the growth of Miami is Latin American and international immigrants. So yeah, the only way you're going to stem population loss in a large northern city is through increase. And I think, look, that's an area, someone who spends time in Toronto, we are tied with Miami. You know this, for the only 2 metropolitan areas in North America that are over 50% foreign born. I forget what you are. You're probably in the teens. I think you're in the teens. Pittsburgh is 3%. I think you're in the teens. You got to goose that, and especially with all the international students coming here. I always say this, John Doerr, the great venture capitalist from Silicon Valley, said every kid who graduates Stanford who's from a foreign country should have a green card stapled. I think staple the green card, staple the employment thing, the labor contract, job, keep as many immigrants and attract as many immigrants as you can.
I know we have another question, but I also think this idea of connecting the universities to a regional placemaking approach is another way to really focus on population.
100%.
And because you can start at pre-K and connect it to that university all the way through the workforce itself.
Well, and you think, and I don't want, you have a system in, I think this is really important, the portfolio of higher education. So you look at University of Michigan now, every kid in America, every elite kid from every private school. Miami, they went nuts when the salutarian of Ransom Everglades Academy got waitlisted at the University of Michigan. They're like, it should be in Harvard, blah, blah, blah. So look, then you could think about this as if they don't get into University of Michigan, share them. Come to Michigan for school. Maybe you didn't get it here, but there's Michigan State, this one, that one. You could begin to think quite creatively about using the incoming, and then folks who grew up here and want a job here, folks who are coming in here. I think there's something here. We poke at it, and we've been talking about it, not by any means that I think there's something in this that's worth all of you thinking about.
Well, and one of the questions says, we've talked a lot about the R1 universities, but how about all the regional universities and the community colleges? A particularly powerful cohort of institutions.
Yeah, I think you have to create a whole system of that, right? Like it's not just one university, but our community colleges are not connected. They're not connected to the universities. They're not connected really even to each other. So if we're really intentional that throughout the life of a human, no matter where you are connected to an institution that will grow you economically in the future.
And you think about the learnings. I'm by no means an expert in this, but I've gotten to do a deep study. You think about the Kalamazoo Promise and what that does in Kalamazoo. You think about Grand Valley State and how that is more aligned with the needs of their, and then you think about the learnings that can go from Kalamazoo to Grand Rapids to Michigan's and There's a lot of learnings in that system. And I believe like you said, thinking about it, we've always thought of these things as independent. There's community colleges, there's two-year institutions, then there's places, then there's business. Thinking about them as systems and how they go together and aligning them is critical. And you have all the components. Every component is here. It's just how do those components get aligned to work better?
Let me throw in a question that is almost never asked in these forums, and I appreciate someone asking it. And it says, how does including people with disabilities play into the conversation?
This is people with disabilities are as much of a population as everyone else that has to be included in this. And I think there's some really good placemaking work that's been done around the country where you can organize the development of a community that is accessible and that can then attract, and accessible not just in the, the graded sidewalks, but also what that community looks like and feels like. If it feels accessible, it's a part of a placemaking strategy, it's a part of a workforce strategy that it should be as much of an economy as everyone else.
Yeah, 1,000%, that any inclusivity agenda has to include this. I don't, it just struck me, and I'm not trying to be, I don't even like the word. I can't figure out a better word than disability, but it's not a disability, it's just a different way. And I think building places that, we try to do that a little bit in some universities, right? We in some, but I think trying to figure out a way to build communities that think of all people as having capabilities. Every single human being is creative. That's the start point. Every single one of us. And then we squelch the living crap out of it. And how? All these kids I grew up with, poor in Newark, New Jersey, they were spectacular and they got left by the wayside. They were smarter than me, better than musicians. And I had the grit, maybe the parents, to get a scholarship to Rutgers. How can we waste it? I think if any of you studied Japanese management, it's mutamura, it's waste. Why are we wasting human capacity? That's the whole thing. We need to build places and platforms that activate every human potential.
How about this small question? How about climate change? It's funny. I was talking to my kids who live in Los Angeles, and they're planning on coming back to Michigan. And I said, why? And they said, look around. Where in the world would you have the kind of natural resources? And I said, well, there are a lot of very beautiful places. They said, yeah, but as the climate gets goofy in California or in the southern tier, just think what an oasis Michigan will be. But so much for the Chamber of Commerce pitch. Is there a real advantage to?
First of all, thank you for making my case. What you just heard, is a conversation going on everywhere in this country. The damn thing is burning up. The people aren't nice. It's too competitive. It's not for my family. There's muds. You hear it now in a way. I'm not just picking this up, because I'm in tune. You hear people saying, I've seen Iran on the way up. I was saying, yeah, California's beautiful, but this is darn close. I was saying this as we drove through the zoo. This place is amazing. I think that, I hate to say this, because this part of the world is really advanced. We have to stop the climate thing. We just have to get on this. But yeah, we get an advantage from it. But at the same time, I don't like the fact that we get, that the Great Lakes get the advantage, because so much of the rest of the world is burning up and hot and horrible. But in the short run, and it's happening very quickly. I think it's happening quickly than your kids and we realize. I think that places that were once hospitable are becoming inhospitable climatically very quickly. That points at the Great Lakes. Plus, never mind the fact that there's all this water. We didn't even get into that. We're just talking about the water. You have all of this water available. It's spectacular.
I also believe that the impact of climate change is one of the primary equity indicators,
yes.
Right? We're not all resilient to the climate impacts. And I feel like that has to be a part of the placemaking strategy in and of itself, whether it's tree canopy or preventing greenhouse gases or using open space and solar and all of the different elements that can impact climate change. I feel like this is a critical issue that we need to think about, because vulnerable neighborhoods, people who are living in vulnerable neighborhoods are not going to have the resources to live lakeside, right? Or to even benefit from a forest that can actually absorb greenhouse gases.
I just want to say one other thing that's really important in the placemaking thing. When you said forest, thinking about our cities as part of a natural environment. If you ask me what I like most about Toronto, It's not the downtown and the built environment and the great arts institutions. It's the fact that it's a city in the forest and the ravine floodplain system. You can go anywhere in the ravines. You can get anywhere in the ravines. And most American cities haven't thought that way. I think this idea of tree canopy forestation, there was a wonderful opinion editorial in the New York Times, I don't know if you read it, but talking about how nature heals cities and how we should be focused much more on the natural. I think American cities have been a little bit behind on that.
Oh, yeah.
And I think that nested with equity. You know, I remember going to Chicago, and I was in a very low-income neighborhood, but it had a wonderful tree canopy. You know, and my perception, it wasn't. And I went into a neighborhood that was denuded, and it felt like a poor neighborhood.
Yeah.
I think all of these things have an equity component. It's very critical to address it.
Toronto has one of the best green economic development strategies in the world. So it's something we can learn from. There's a green roof for every new development downtown Toronto.
Yeah, it's the smartest. I mean, I have plenty of things I can complain about in Toronto, but the greening and the natural environment is very, very smart.
Okay, Richard, we've got to wrap up, but before we go, let's sort of come full circle. A number of people have said, you made a fascinating comparison of Ann Arbor and Austin. So what's Austin doing that Ann Arbor should be doing, or East Lansing, or Wayne State?
So I think, you know, looking back, knowing Austin very well, I actually think this was intentional. And we could see the same thing in Palo Alto, the Bay Area, the same thing in Cambridge, Massachusetts, the same thing in Boulder, and the same thing in Austin, as a way to keep young people, young talent, and grow the economy. This wasn't happenstance. This was, if we want to keep these youngsters here in the tech fields, in the entertainment fields, we have to build something for them. This began after the war in Stanford, after the war in MIT, and then Austin. This began, you know, what happened in Austin is this is a very important lesson. A guy named George Kosmetsky, who built a very famous high-tech company, was denied tenure at Carnegie Mellon. True story. And he moved to Austin, and he said, you know, they denied me tenure at Carnegie Mellon, so I'm going to build my startup here and a startup economy, created an institute called IC Squared. They then went after the federal dollars for Sematech and MCC. They then went to Silicon Valley to attract the companies and were able to grow it. So they were very intentional about growing a college town into a high-tech and entertainment economy. It isn't hard. You have to be intentional about it.
Okay, well, I think that brings us to the end of the session. Could we all thank both Anika and Richard
Thank
Florida?
you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Honored and humbled.